recent decades, but we are substantially short of what is the goal of the Paris Climate Agreement, which is to limit global warming to under 2 degrees Celsius. So it's really helpful to then think about the impacts and implications of global climate change through the ultimate amount of global warming experienced. Okay, so it doesn't, the timings of these things aren't as important as what total level of global warming we experience. So if you can imagine a variety of futures where the Earth has warmed up from 1.5 to as much as 4 degrees Celsius, and then each one of those colored lines represents a road to the impacts at a global level. Okay, so we're looking at the total amount of global warming, because ultimately that determines the extremity of the impacts that we experience. So when we look at things like temperatures, of course, as you allow more global warming to happen, that means intense increases to extremes related to heat. So the land changes more than the ocean does, so we actually see more warming over land, and especially in cities due to the urban heat island effect. And that gets worse the more global warming we see. Turns out an atmosphere that is warmer is thirstier, so we see more evaporation in the form of soil moisture, the worse global warming continues to get. So we limit the amount of soil moisture reductions by limiting the total amount of CO2, or total amount of warming. And then really important for things like our experiences here in Richmond would be things like the most extreme precipitation event. So as the atmosphere warms up, it's not only thirstier, it can actually hold more water in it. It's a bigger bucket. And so when it tips over to create rain, more rain falls out in a warmed atmosphere than a non-warmed atmosphere. And so relevant to this discussion would be in a 3 degrees Celsius warming future, we would see about 20% more rain on the rainiest day of the year. And with help from my friend Sean Sublett, we were kind of investigating the maximum 24-hour precipitation amounts, and that would be about 1 to 2 inches more rain in 24 hours in that kind of a future. Now, put that in perspective, our sewers are designed to 1 inch in 24 hours. So you're adding an additional design storm to those systems with no other change in the infrastructure at hand. So you can see the level of intensity of those extremes that we experience are directly related to the sort of preparation around, well, what will be the impact in the future. It's super important to think about that. Zooming in a little bit more on the United States, we know it's not just heat and water. There's also other things at play here. One of them being Norfolk, Virginia has the highest rate of sea level rise of anywhere else on the entire east coast of North America. Now, that's because of localized additions to global sea level change, but that will continue to be a challenge that those communities along the coast will have to deal with, not only until the end of the century, but potentially centuries afterwards. Also important to this discussion are hurricanes. As the atmosphere warms up, it becomes stronger at creating even more intense hurricanes. Now, we've also seen some trends related to those where they're slowing down over space. So as a storm travels across a landscape, it's dropping more rain in the same place in a shorter amount of time. And they're becoming stronger faster already. And those two trends are expected to continue depending on the total level of climate change reached. And so I want to focus the last little part of the talk here before we take a couple questions on what really is the kind of understanding around these like economic implications. And so tend to hear a lot of times about the two main sources of risk when it comes to the economic situation for a given organization. Now, we've been talking a lot about physical risks. So those are those actual climate-related stressors, things like heat waves or extreme precipitation that directly impact maybe the operations that you might have. But there's also the transition to a lower carbon economy will also carry with it transition risks. So this is, how does that change the things that are in your supply chain and the cost of those things in relation to a potential like carbon price in the future? So when we talk about the economic implications of climate change, it's really not just the fact that there will be these impacts, but also the transition of regulation and things like that over time. So I'm not an expert in the transition stuff. You are way more able to answer those questions. But that's the kind of thought process process that's going on in these kind of talks around sustainability and ESG kind of reporting. And so when we think about, I just want to leave us with some of the newest information about the sectors that are impacted regionally here, and you'll kind of see these conversations scale into the panel that will happen after this conversation. And so one of the big papers that came out recently estimated for the first time potential overvaluation in the US housing market because of unrealized flood risks. And so using an updated way of understanding flood risk, they estimated that potentially up to $237 billion worth of overvaluation in the housing market. Now, that is an incredible number, and this is only one study. Consensus is not reached from one data point. However, their conclusions added a little bit more detail in that these overvaluations disproportionately impact lower income individuals as they lose equity, and then more importantly, municipalities that might have a lot of these overvalued assets could see shortfalls in their revenue related to tax rolls. So this is a very important conversation to begin having around the ideas of the housing market and its exposure to climate risks. Now, also relevant to the panel would be things around electricity grid infrastructure. And it turns out that the electricity grid, some of the biggest aspects of the economic implications of this should come down to transformers and vegetation management in this paper. And so transformers are less effective or efficient in a warmer future, so those have a shorter lifespan and need to be replaced. And then vegetation management, as you have more and more growth in places of new and other types of vegetation, those two contribute to a major cost increase in the future. So this paper had a thought experiment. It was basically, what if we thought of 3 different approaches to making upgrades to the climate or to the electricity grid? One where it's proactive, one where it's reactive, and one where we don't do anything and nothing changes. Now that nothing changes is not probably reality, but it serves as a good baseline. And interestingly, even in a mid-range or a mid-emissions scenario, we see that the proactive approach saves up to 50% of the potential cost of doing nothing. So there's a huge cost avoidance when it comes to things like infrastructure, especially around things like the electricity grid. Now, another really important aspect of our infrastructure are things like roads and rail. Almost every business relies on transportation of some sort to get goods and services to people that need them, and the workforce that uses those different types of networks. And the same kind of thought experiment was, what about the investment now as a proactive approach versus the long-term implications for things like the US road network? Turns out roads don't do a very good job in extreme temperatures. We actually saw this happen 2 summers ago in Portland, Oregon, where pieces of I-5 were buckling and breaking due to that extreme heat. As heat extremes become more common, that potentially has an effect on our road construction. And if we don't potentially include that in our planning, it could be as much as a 40 times cost reduction. And again, this is based on one study that came out, right? It's not consensus, but nonetheless, across the board, we tend to be seeing the same kinds of patterns, is that proactively addressing the adaptation question could save a lot of money and headaches for the future, especially in our region. As the Southeast Regional Chapter Lead for the 5th National Climate Assessment, it is very clear across a variety of sectors repeatedly that the Southeast tends to be ranked the highest among those regions that are impacted by climate change. And this is just one paper from 2017 showing that across the Southeast, that has the biggest chance of losing total percentages of GDP because of climate-related impacts to not only things like infrastructure, but workforce and occupational safety, things like agriculture and farm yields. So this is a very comprehensive approach to understanding the implications of climate change on our economy. Now, I want to say, well, what can we do? It's really easy to stand up here and be kind of, in a sense, talking about the bad. Let's talk a little bit about the good. Here in Richmond, we're really fortunate to have just adopted the RVA Green 2050 Climate Equity Action Plan, which includes in it a greenhouse gas reduction goal of 100% by 2050. And that's pretty much in line with the requirements of that future where very limited amounts of warming continue. And you can see, based on their own accounting of this, the city of Richmond is doing a very good job to align with those targets, with their actual emissions. And a big portion of this is also going to need to be the business community. And so I'm really happy to say that I think a group from Charlottesville came all the way here that's thinking about promoting a program that they found very successful in Charlottesville. It's known as the Green Business Alliance. And what the two bars are showing is the relative decrease in the amount of their Green Business Alliance's greenhouse gas emissions from working together on kind of solutions to their emissions. And I'll let Susan Cruz wave. Hello, Susan. If you're interested in potentially joining a pilot of that project, of that alliance here in Richmond, please reach out to her, because they saw almost 30% reduction in their greenhouse gases within a couple of years. And so working together is way better than working apart when it comes to these sorts of these sorts of solutions that are necessary. And what I am happy to say is, too, that you find yourself here at the Science Museum of Virginia, where we've been very proud to be a demonstrative kind of working laboratory to show people different ways of adapting to the climate threats of the future. From you can actually see it right over your shoulder, there's a stormwater harvesting cistern that would harvest the stormwater coming off of our historic train sheds, as well as a variety of green infrastructure that we use for best management practices to absorb and funnel stormwater and filter stormwater instead of funneling it. One best example is, you probably saw a big fence outside. Well, we removed an entire parking lot. After building a parking deck, we removed an entire parking lot to create a new civic green space right out in front of the Science Museum, making best practices not only for best management for stormwater, for lowering heat, for cleaning the air, but using native plants throughout the entire park to promote their use in landscape architecture projects around Virginia. And then I will say that we also have made major upgrades to the building overall. This event space is LEED Gold. Yes, LEED Platinum, LEED Gold, something, yeah, that one.
There's a plaque over there.
There's a plaque, yeah. Oh, you're in a very high achieving, low impact building right here, as well as we've replaced a roof that was very dark with a reflective roof. We've also made use of performance contracts that actually reduce the amount of energy that we're using for things like our HVAC system. So really across, not just the programs that I get to do and share the information with people from all over our audiences, but really trying to personify what it is to be a responsible organization and nonprofit in the world as we move forward. So I'm absolutely thrilled that you are all here, that I've gotten to share with you a little bit about the business of climate, set the stage, as it were, for the illustrious panel that we will be hearing from. And I want to say thank you again for your attention. And I'm happy, I think we have just a couple of minutes where we're going to hand it over to Rich for the panel. So yeah, thank you so much for your attention, everyone. Questions? I'm hearing that we have two questions worth of time. If anybody has been left. Yes, please.
Okay, apologies if I'm off topic. I told my daughter I was coming to a climate summit today, and she said, "Oh, you mean about the Willow Project?" And I said, "I don't know what you're talking about." So I'm wondering if you could give us like the 25-cent version of your impression of the Willow Project and what we would take back to members of our family who have questions about it.
Sure. So I will admit that I am not an expert on the Willow Project whatsoever. And so let me just, I guess it's a new approval of a project for fossil fuel development in a portion of Alaska that currently doesn't have that. But my understanding is that those land areas have been open for that kind of development, and it was just the approval process. Now, don't want to speak to that particular project in specifics. However, the IPCC report that was released on Monday does acknowledge that new and expanded investments in fossil fuel infrastructure are not quite in alignment with the futures where we avoid the worst impacts of climate change. So that kind of conclusion from a body of scientists tends to be something that I rely on very heavily. And so projects like that, in the eyes of the IPCC report, would be that it's probably something that we would need to then offset considerably in the future to reduce the impact of that new infrastructure on emissions of heat-trapping gases. So I would say that it's somewhat like in opposition to the conclusions of the IPCC, and ultimately there will need to be some additional kind of things that happen: reforestation, carbon dioxide removal, which is an emerging technology that hasn't been proven, but nonetheless will be an important part of reducing the amount of CO2 that's in the atmosphere. So I hope that helps. Thank you for your question. Other questions?
This might be a really simple question, but I was wondering, is it simply the southern states are experiencing a greater impact from global warming just because we start warmer, or is there a more complicated scientific answer?
Sure. So that that map that I showed you that had the disproportionately high impact on county GDP integrates, like, I think 17 different sectors of relationships between future climate variables and its economic impact. So temperature is just one of those things that is super important. But yeah, you're right. Largely, even though we are already in a warm climate, adding additional extreme warm days where we've not had them in the past does complicate things like outdoor work schedules and productivity. So that's one major aspect of like the agricultural economic impact of climate change in the South, is that there's a lot of outdoor workers, and if it is too hot to work, then we run into a very serious issue with that. So that's one aspect of a variety of other sectoral impacts that disproportionately affect the Southeast relative to other regions of the country. You're welcome.